Hey, everybody, let's talk about market research and looking at your customer and your client and what their needs are from a customer service and also from an engineering perspective to make sure you fully understand the product or the system that you're designing and to make sure that you understand what people are looking for. Really, if you think about it, without customers, without people pulling that product or that engineering work toward them, you're not going to have a job. And so thinking about customers, I also want to just say, and I want to fully recognize that there are probably not a lot of other courses that you take as an engineer where you really dive deeply into the whole idea of marketing and sales and understanding customer needs. So hopefully this is interesting for you, and I can give you a few insights about why this is so very critically important. Let me say that there will be an upcoming homework, and I'll make sure that that is actually linked and published so that you can have a look at that future homework where you're going to be asked to develop a market assessment tool and actually talk to or collect some data from some actual customers. You're going to be asked to put together kind of a pilot instrument. It could be a focus group or a survey or like a structured interview process. And we're going to act, like I said, ask you to collect some data from some real life people to give you the practice, to give you the experience of doing that. And then also we're going to expect you to refine that data collection tool in such a way that you can take it out like this summer and actually use it to collect a little bit more data from your potential market. So the question then is, why do we go through all this work to collect information from our market? They're, again, as I talked about, they're your audience, they're your customers, they're your livelihood. And I will tell you this, that sometimes collecting information from your customers does not have to be anything super fancy. A lot of times it's about listening to them. It's about understanding where they're coming from. Again, understanding what those needs are and the things that motivate them. There's a guy named Tom Peters who wrote a book called In Search of Excellence. And he talked about how the return on investment from listening is greater than any other activity that you could possibly do in a business. And I would argue as an engineer, that same principle applies. You really do depend on them to purchase the product or the particular engineering design that you're working on. One of the things I want you to think about is, what are the motivators and what are the values that customers or clientele think about as they think about a product? What are the things that motivate them? It could be about making money. It could be about making their job or their life a little bit easier. It could be something that improves their health and safety. I think about some of the work being done in this class in the environment and natural resources area. And if you think about, like, why would we want to protect Lake Mendota through the proper design of a wetland or a stormwater retention facility? Yeah, there's the aesthetic part of it. We want to be able to fish and swim in those lakes and we want good water quality, but a lot of it also boils down to our personal health and safety. There may be some other type of intangible benefit that may not be obvious. And the more you talk to people, the more you ask open ended probing questions, the more you may in fact begin to uncover some of those important motivators and some of those important values that people, it may save them time, as I talked about, and it may be something that is fun. I mean, a big motivator for a lot of products, a lot of consumer products, is about making your life fun, making your life more exciting, making your life more entertaining. I'm not going to go into this in a great deal of detail, but there are lots and lots of motivators. There are lots of things that people have, they place their value in. And it's important for you to understand and know what those values and what those motivating principles are. Let me just suggest to you that there are a number of them on the bottom of this pyramid that are pretty basic: reducing risk, saving time, making money, simplifying, those kinds of things. As you move to the higher levels of the pyramid, you might think of these as things that are maybe a little bit less likely to be motivators in a biological systems engineering course, but there may be some that are important. For example, wellness and therapeutic value. If you're working on a product that reduces stress or a new food product that improves health, again, there are variable components or variable motivators that we can base our work on in this particular class, but we're going to tend to be more often toward the bottom half of this pyramid with many of our engineering design products in this, or projects in this course. Talking to customers is a good idea. As an engineer, while you oftentimes don't think of yourself as a salesperson, that is really important to identify the needs of the customer, make sure that you're working toward the problem that they would hope that you would solve. And sometimes they don't really know exactly what that product is themselves. And that's where communication comes in. That's where asking lots of questions. I've already talked a little bit about goals, motivations, values, profit growth, that sort of thing. It's important to understand how your product might be used in the context of a business or an operation, whether that's a factory or a manufacturing facility. Or we have one of our groups this current semester that are measuring, hopefully developing an instrument to measure the moisture level in a tree or in a log. So understanding where and how and what the context is in which that instrument will be used is really quite important. And again, I talked about the importance of values. Our values are changing as a society. We right now do place a lot of value in things like safety and sustainability. And I heard that early in the semester when I listened to you speak about what were the motivators that got you into the BSE program. A lot of you talked about things like sustainability. And again, it's important to keep those values in mind as you talk to your customers, as you talk to your market. As you're working on the homework for this particular section on understanding your market, it's really important that you not get too hung up on the features of a particular design. And the reason I say that, we're trying to keep things at a higher level to understand what those customer needs, issues, motivators, values, what those really are, because there may be multiple ways to specify a product to meet those different needs. So what we're really trying to get at is that core of what is motivating people to possibly desire your product. I'll just give you an example here. If you take just a typical iPhone, I don't really care I don't care if it has 256 gigabytes or a terabyte of storage space. What I care about is that it holds all of the content that I want it to hold. Like my phone has every photo that I've ever taken, including hard copy photos that I've, scanned and all the way back into the 1990s. And it's really important to me that I've got the storage space to hold that kind of content, or at least to be able to access the cloud to do so. I don't care that it has a beastly A12 Bionic 7 nanometer processor. All I want to know is that if I take a trip someplace and I'm on a 747 flying across the country, that I can watch a video and it is going to look spectacular, like I'm sitting in a movie theater. That's all I really care about, right? That's what motivates me. I don't really care what the model chip is, when the chip was designed, who built the chip. I'm interested in how this thing performs. It's more about the function than the specifications. Although the specifications are important for the designer, when you're talking to your market, when you're talking to your customer, we want to know more. What are their needs? What is it that motivates them to possibly purchase your product? Similarly, I don't care that it's got a 12 megapixel camera with a 12, I don't even know what MP is, a 12 MP telephoto shooter. All I want to know is that I can spend, or I should say it this way, if I'm going to spend $800 or $1,000 on this camera, I better be able to take really good, high quality pictures that would be similar to if I went out and hired a professional photographer. So let me just give you like a really quick example of where listening to the customer is important. Let me just use this simple example of ketchup. Ketchup has been around since the 1800s. The Heinz family was the first one to come up with kind of a special ketchup recipe back in the 1800s, and really little changed during that time in terms of the ketchup market. We were for more than, well, several decades, we were manufacturing and selling ketchup in glass bottles. Not that long ago, I would say probably back in the early 1980s is when we began to see more plastic. The market really hadn't changed. And if you look at these ketchup bottles, there were probably engineers who designed these who thought, oh, here's a cool shape. Here's one with some interesting curves and some interesting features. Here's some that are taller, maybe greater capacity. But they probably weren't designing these containers with the customer in mind. As I talked about in the 1980s, this began to change, and this was based on customer feedback. I do remember personally having broken ketchup bottles on the kitchen table Why? Because as kids, we were often the ones that were asked to go into the kitchen, into the refrigerator and grab the ketchup. And undoubtedly, about once a year, we would drop a glass bottle of ketchup and we'd have a big mess on the kitchen floor. We also know, and this was the case again with me growing up, it was really difficult to get those last bits of ketchup out of the bottom of the bottle. This sounds gross to a lot of you. You may or may not have experienced this. I remember in our family, you couldn't get about the last half inch of ketchup out of the bottom, especially if the lid had been unscrewed or left off for any period of time. It was kind of crusty and gross down there. So we would either try to scoop it out with a knife, or more often my mom would go into the kitchen and put about 2 inches of warm water and she'd slosh it around, and we had to pass around a watered down ketchup product for those last few French fries that we might be eating for our dinner that night. So lots of different motivations, but this was only gained by talking to customers. And that's the case with so many of the different products and things that we take for granted every day. So they began to reinvent ketchup. They were frustrated. Again, I talked about getting the last product out. The crud around the lid was gross. The first out, even if you didn't dilute it with water, like I talked about, the first out, if that ketchup had sat in the refrigerator for like a week, it was kind of watery and gross. And because of that, there were a lot of customers who stored those glass bottles upside down. So you had to put it like in the refrigerator door and crowd things around it and hope that it didn't dump out when you opened up the refrigerator. So lots and lots of needs. And obviously we don't sell ketchup in cans like this, but I'll come back to that in just a moment. Here's another really important part of this. They also said, okay, we're talking to a lot of adults. We're talking to a lot of purchasers, a lot of consumers that are actually, pulling out their credit card or their cash and they're paying for the ketchup, but who are they buying for? What they learned in doing their research is the vast majority of ketchup, more than half of the ketchup being consumed by families, was being consumed by kids ages 6 through 12. So like, why not talk to them? So the Heinz Corporation began to talk to children. So the idea here is you want to get as close as you can to that end user of the product. And that's the same in BSE 508. The closer we can get you to talking to that end user or that potential end user, the better your information will be. One of the things they learned in talking with kids is that if kids had the opportunity, they like drawing. That's why they like going to Denny's restaurant or a place that might have the old school ketchup bottles with the pointy cap, the plastic lid, so they could draw on their plate or they could draw onto their food. So like, why not build that into a ketchup bottle that you might be able to go to the grocery store and buy? Well, the problem is you can't draw with a traditional glass topped ketchup bottle or a glass ketchup bottle that has a metal top on it. So they began to look around at other industries. So like, how are other companies, how are other industries how are they dealing with this issue of dispensing a fairly viscous liquid product like ketchup? And one of the industries that had some similarities was the shampoo industry. So they went into the shampoo industry and they found this valve that you find on a lot of different types of shampoo products so that you could put on the top of a ketchup bottle. Ketchup and shampoo, not all that different in terms of its physical properties. Why not license that lid design from a chemical company and apply it over and use it with ketchup? They also redesigned the bottle to make it more squeezable, more ergonomically friendly for both a child's hand and an adult's hand. And they also wanted to make it out of a material that was soft enough, pliable enough so that you could squeeze the ketchup bottle. And again, if you're a 6-year-old kid, to be able to draw with it, especially now that it's got this fancy silicone valve that's also going to be cleaner, by the way. And they also said, like, remember that problem of water accumulating in the top of the ketchup? What if we stored it upside down? They found like, well, it's still kind of tippy if we do that. So they optimized the lid diameter. They optimized it relative to the size and the scale of the ketchup bottle, considering engineering properties like the center of gravity. And they also optimized it, if you see here, the opening of 1/10 of an inch, optimized for both flow, but also so that a kid could draw on their cheeseburger or on their French fries, they could draw the shapes that they wanted to draw. So consumers loved the new lid. They indicated that they were willing to pay a premium price. And that's why if you go and buy Heinz ketchup, a In this particular case, a 20-ounce bottle of Heinz ketchup is going to fetch a premium price, probably 20 to 40% more if you go to a typical grocery store, largely because of the container. So containers matter, customers matter, the customer needs matter. And again, the idea here is if you can get this as close as possible to that end user, you're going to always find and collect more information. So lots of lessons to be learned. Products continue to evolve. Make sure that you're constantly listening and talking to your customers. Pay attention to details. Details do matter. Don't be afraid to look around at how other industries have designed for similar needs. That's why Heinz went to, I think it was Prel shampoo, and they looked at this particular silicon valve for the top of maybe adapting that for the top of a ketchup container. Also know the trends of the industry that you're working in. Seemingly trivial physical designs can make a huge difference in terms of customer appeal, but the only way to get at that is by talking, listening, continuously iterating, never being satisfied with that end product. And through the interaction with customers, the reinvention in the end will always win the day if you're innovative. So the question some of you might have is like, well, what about this? This kind of flies in the face of a lot of what you just talked that I just talked about. This is over at the library at the corner of University Campus and Randall. And if you think about this, so yeah, the customers in there are typically college students or faculty who are coming over on campus. But there's also the customer, the industrial customer. In this particular case, it's the staff, it's the waiters and waitresses and bartenders who at the end of the day need to refill these ketchup containers at the library. And the easiest way to do that is by having a wide mouth lid. So sometimes the customers that we talk about are not always obvious. In some cases, there's a middle customer, as is the case here. So be careful with how you parse out and think about that customer base that you want to talk to. Just a few other things to talk about here. People appreciate being asked their opinions. It does create a sense of goodwill, of the ability to engage with people. You want a good, positive relationship with your customers. And if you don't ask questions, there are other companies who will. So make sure you're talking. You'll learn things that surprise you. You'll discover things that'll help improve your products. You'll see it used in the context of their environment, their workplace, their homes, wherever it is that you're meeting and talking with them. And you'll learn about other things related to the barriers to using that product, some of the reliability issues, maybe cases in which that product gets misused. It's really only possible to do that by drilling down and getting as close to that end user as you can possibly get. If you don't talk to your customer, somebody else will. Again, the stuff that you learn might surprise you. You'll discover new things, just a lot of benefits to doing this. Here's a few other things. We talk about designing for like really, ketchup. Ketchup's been around now for 140 years. So that's not a particularly new product. It's also important to be keeping your eyes open for other trends, for new concepts, new opportunities, knowing how big these markets are, knowing what your competitors are doing. That bottom bullet is being able to look at trends so that you're designing, looking out into the future. What does that mean? 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? In the agricultural and biological industry, we're maybe probably right now thinking about food products that are going to be consumed, say, 2 or 3 years from now. But if you're designing cars or electronics or washing machines, you probably want to be looking out 5 to 10 years down the road. There's a really great website, and I will link to this. It's called Trend Hunter. I would suggest that you not pay money to subscribe to it, because the non-subscriber front part of it, or the non-subscriber interface, is still really cool. There's a lot of really good information, interesting information about what some of these longer term trends are. And it's something you might be interested in, especially as you start thinking about job hunting, maybe selling yourself because of your forward thinking or your creativity. Trend Hunter is like a really cool site. I actually go there quite often and enjoy looking at it. So in the homework that's associated with this particular module, I'm going to ask you to do some research. I'm actually going to ask you, first of all, to develop a research instrument or a research tool. This could include the detailed protocol for a semi-structured interview, a focus group, or a survey. And there are lots of different ways to collect data. I'll go into more detail with the assignment. And again, there's a whole other segment to this module on the details for doing things like focus groups and interviews and when each one might be appropriate and when you might use certain techniques and also how you might analyze that information. At the UW library, there are also, I've talked about this, the research guides that are out there. There's some really great market research guides. You can find those under the engineering research guide. It's over on the left-hand side. There's a whole section on markets and market research. There are lots of already detailed market analyses, white papers. Some of the trend data that I talked about is oftentimes available through the UW System Library. There are also specialty market associations who specialize in particular products. And this is just but one example. It's called the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. So this is the big association that does things like construction machinery and forestry equipment and a lot of agricultural equipment. So the big companies that are active in the agricultural industry are part of AEM, or again, the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. They do have a lot of good information looking at the types of markets, the data, the information. You see right here, kind of in the middle of this particular slide, it says market data. So I do suggest that if you're working on a machinery systems project, either in this class or in other classes in the future, that you kind of get to know AEM a little bit. I'm actually working with them on a big research project right now involving autonomous equipment, autonomous agricultural machinery, and looking at some of the risk and safety analysis. And they are just a really great organization to become acquainted with if you're working in the whole sphere of agricultural machinery and machinery systems. I kind of consider this last slide to be somewhat optional. It's a little bit beyond the scope of where we're at in this particular semester. But I'll say this, a lot of you, the majority of you, I would actually guess in the next 10 to 20 years will probably be working as BSE engineers in the US, but I would argue that half of you or more will also be working with customers and markets in other countries and other parts of the world. And it's also really critical to get to know those customers, to build relationships, to learn from them. Engineers who have to work in another country, remember I talked in a previous module about the work that I did where I was headquartered in central Illinois, but I was asked to go out and spend time in Washington and Oregon. It's not a different country, but from the perspective of somebody who had spent all their time working in Illinois, it kind of was like a different country. It was really critical that I went out there and I began to meet with people to build trust, that they got to know me. We built a relationship. We spent time, simple things like going out with clients and having coffee or having lunch together. Those relationships are really, really quite important. I do have a couple of links here from a woman named Erin Meyer. I'll provide the links that'll be separate as optional links. And there's also a YouTube video where she talks about how important it is to get to know people in their culture, in their setting, and that our cultures are very different across the world. But it's vital that you begin to think about, if you're assigned to a market in Germany or someplace in Asia or Africa, that you begin to think about how can I build those relationships with my customers. And I'll tell you, the biggest part of that, number one, is openness to learn. Second of all is time. It does take a lot of time. It takes a lot of trust building, and trust building takes time. So I hope that this is helpful. This kind of gets you kicked off here in terms of thinking about customers, studying your markets, beginning to think about how you might approach data collection from the customers who may be benefiting from your product or system. I look forward when the time comes to seeing how you guys do that as students in BSE 508. And with that, I will find my stop recording button and we will talk to you soon.